let's go through the light novel series of Can't Fear Your Own World for a better idea on Kisuke Urahara's character. Despite most of the OG gang of Bleach being missing from Can't Fear Your Own World, Kisuke Urahara was featured in the light novel series. Book 1. He did not have a big part to play in the first book, but we heard his name a few times. Kisuke Urahara was said to have strengthened the seals on Aizen after the events of the Thousand-Year Blood War. Hisagi, the main character, was set to interview Urahara, and before going off to do so, he would have a conversation with Shinji in regards to this interview. All the way to Kisuke's, huh? That's tough. That guy never says anything direct in an interview, Shinji would say. This would foreshadow what Hisagi would soon face, perhaps the most challenging interview he would ever have. Kisuke's name would also be brought up in a royal clan meeting, hissed through the tongue of the venomous Tokunada Tsunayashiro. Tokunada would mention to Yoruichi that she was not aware of what the Soul King was from the start, but Kisuke Urahara should be aware, showing you how much Kisuke knows of the world, even more so than a royal clan member. That's what we learned of Kisuke in the first book. This leads to the second book, where he had a bigger part to play. Book 2. The main interaction with Kisuke was through the series protagonist, Shuhei Hisagi. As a journalist, Hisagi would interview Urahara in regards to the Quincy invasion and war at his shop in the world of the living. In the second book, we are introduced to the two through Urahara convincing Hisagi to buy a guitar. Kisuke would effectively rip Hisagi off as he'd pay 3 months' salary worth for the guitar, living up to the shady and mischievous personality we all love to give him. This would lead to the first interview. While I won't go through all the things mentioned, I will discuss some important details. Something I enjoyed in this conversation was how it really showed off Kisuke's personality, his wit, his charm, but also his quick thinking and unpredictability. Funnily enough, all those traits he was known for in combat carried into this interview. Furthermore, the following conversation really showed how cunning and intelligent Kisuke is. His scientific knowledge is often praised, but his knowledge of people is what makes me believe that he is undoubtedly the most intelligent character in Bleach. What would seem like a regular conversation actually felt like a chess match of words between Hisagi and Urahara. Hisagi tried his best to play his cards right and gather enough information, but he was always shut down by Kisuke. Hisagi at one point started to sweat profusely, just off what would have been seen as a witty conversation. Urahara was always the type to be multiple steps ahead in combat, and this interaction showed that it was no different in regular conversations, as Urahara is always playing mental chess with everyone as his opponent. The two would start by talking about Ichigo Kurosaki, how his father was an ex-Gote captain and his mother a Quincy. They decided it wasn't the right time to let it be known that Ichigo shares Quincy heritage, despite being the world savior. The interview would then get deeper, as Hisagi would say, "Mr. Urahara, no, former chief of the Department of Research and Development, I came today to expose your past." Urahara would slightly narrow his eyes and reply, "Please don't show your scary side all of a sudden like that, Mr. Hisagi. What'll you do if Jinta bursts out crying from where he's watching from behind the sliding door? He might start wetting his bed again." This would result in an outburst from Jinta, and we see Tessai and Ururu come into the picture as well for a short period. As the interview would get more serious and Hisagi would dig deeper, Urahara's answers would get trickier, showing just how well he was at navigating conversations. When Hisagi would ask about Jinta and Ururu and how they have unique Ryuku, Urahara would say, "That was a bit obvious for a leading question. Since we've been used to Mr. Tosen's interview style, don't you think that's a crude way to try to get at people's weak spots?" The counter comment by Urahara stung Hisagi because he knew it was right. Again, showing you how quick and adaptable Urahara was, knowing the exact points of weakness to pick on. Initially, it seemed like Urahara did not want to share such information, and as a result, Hisagi would come up with plans in his mind on how to get him to divulge the said information. All of that was thrown out the window when Urahara would say, "So, what do you think those two are?" This surprised Hisagi because he felt that he was able to read Urahara for a bit. But Kisuke was as unpredictable as ever. Kisuke would mention how Jinta and Ururu were similar to Nemu, but still quite different from her. He would then say, "I'm sure that Mr. Kurotsuchi already knows that and is imagining my bitter expression as he dances for joy about Nemu's growth, thinking I've surpassed Urahara," and then followed up with, "Well, I guess he wouldn't actually be able to imagine that. That's because I've never genuinely been bitter in front of Mr. Kurotsuchi." Urahara would grin mischievously like a child when saying that. This can be interpreted in a few ways. In short, you can view it as how he never felt threatened in front of Mayuri. He never felt like they were even competing. Urahara was always the guy to chase, and here he was saying how he's never felt that insecurity around Mayuri. This could be that he's just not a bitter person like Mayuri, or it could be that he believes he is so far ahead of him. Perhaps it could be a bit of both. The interview would then lead to Mr. Tsunayashiro, in which Urahara would say he heard about him becoming the head of the clan from Yoruichi, and now Shunsui would know more about him. He also mentioned how he was aware of him and Tosen's past, although it happened long before he became captain. You can read about their past in my Tosen video. The conversation would then lead to Hikone, a Soul Reaper-like boy who Hisagi encountered, a boy who'd say he was Tokunaga's servant. Hisagi would mention how the boy had some mixed spiritual pressure, and Kisuke would reply, "I see." So that's how the Tsunayashiro family is willing to go. But the hollow element wasn't supposed to be a requirement, or maybe they were trying to achieve something different. This was an interesting response. He mentioned how a hollow element wasn't supposed to be a requirement. Could he have been referring to a Soul King candidate, or something else? They would then touch on how there were two other beings, similar to Hikone in Ichigo and Ginjo Kugo. Hisagi would then ask Urahara to explain, and he'd pull down a whiteboard. The whiteboard already had drawings and writing on it. It was titled, "How to Make a Demonic Soul Reaper." Urahara would then say oops and delete it. Now this could have been just to mess around with Hisagi, which I can see happening. I don't think he'd make such an error, but it also could have been that he just doesn't care and he was actually working on such a thing, on how to make a demonic Soul Reaper. Maybe it was his own cheeky way of giving Hisagi information, with him not fully picking up on it. Was this the plan with Ichigo? Or perhaps someone else? Only time will tell. If I were to guess, I would say it was Rukia. Urahara had taken a liking to her initially by planting his Hogyoku in her. We still don't know the exact reason for that. Could it have been that Rukia was initially Urahara's champion, the one to change the world with the Hogyoku and do his bidding? Or perhaps, with the Hogyoku in Rukia, she would be the one pushing Ichigo forward, giving him the strength to reach his potential. Perhaps she was Urahara's plan B if Ichigo were to falter. Knowing Urahara, it would be odd for him not to have contingency plans in place for just about everything. So it won't be out of the question to believe that Rukia was his plan B. Furthermore, upon him losing consciousness in the 1,000-Year Blood War, he would say something along the lines of, "It is up to you, Ichigo and Rukia," perhaps foreshadowing a greater power within Rukia. To add on to this, in a Q&A, a fan asked Kubo why the text behind Rukia in the manga had two different styles. Kubo would reply saying it does have a certain meaning and he may draw it later. For reference, every character of each race has their name written in a certain style. The Shinigami have a sort of Japanese brush ink style. Quincy's have this, and Hollows have this. With the Vizards, they have two styles for their names, perhaps signifying the Shinigami and Hollow powers within them. Shinji had the Shinigami style here, but once he gained Hollow powers, the depiction of the text also changed. All this led fans to believe that the style of text represents their race. Perhaps this is hinting at Rukia being a demonic Soul Reaper, as mentioned earlier, or maybe even a witch, linking the series of Bleach and Burn the Witch together. Or maybe a demonic Soul Reaper is exactly that, a witch. Back to the interview with Hisagi and Urahara. They would continue on the conversation and talk about the Fullbringers. The two would mention how Soul Reapers must have known about them, or at least the visual department must have, which was run by the Tsunayashiro clan, hinting at a connection between the two. More of which I'll cover in my next video on Ginjo Kugo, so be sure to subscribe for that video. The interview will then be cut short. Urahara would sense that the two were surrounded. Yukio, the Fullbringer who aided the gang in the 1,000-Year Blood War, would then enter the picture and mention how he'd want to speak with Urahara to recruit him for his company. As the two would run their usual games through conversation, a group of men and women wearing black with masks would appear and attack Hisagi. Urahara would surmise that this was the work of a Fullbringer ability, and Hisagi would notice that he was the only one getting attacked. We then see the introduction of Ora Michibane, and we'd had some funny interactions between the characters, all through Hisagi's expense of course. I'll save more of this for Hisagi's video since this one is focused on Kisuke. Hisagi would battle Ora. All the while, Kisuke would watch as he so often does. he'd step in and remove Hisagi's Gentai spirit mark, which limited his abilities in the world of the living, as he was having a tough time against Aura. Through the interactions, both Yukio and Aura, who were in the same company, would remark how terrifying of a foe Kisuke is, despite how quickly he learned of things, and how aptly he responded to the situation at hand. Kisuke would join the battle with Hisagi, and they both go on to face Aura. The two would have to fend off giant reddish-black dragons, ones of Eastern descent, all summoned by Aura, who had the Kito-like ability to subjugate Reishi as a foe-bringer. Kisuke would use his Zanpakuto Benihime to attack the dragons. As they'd continue to regenerate, Urahara would start a full chant of Hado number 91, Senju Koten Taiho, and unleash it, which was said to be stronger than the Grand Ray Seros that Grimmjow uses. After Hado number 91, Kisuke would bring out the big guns, the biggest one we know of in Hado number 99, Goryuten Metsu. We've seen this Hado only once before with Aizen in the Thousand Year Blood War, and so it makes sense that Kisuke would know it as well. 5 pillars of light in the form of dragons would appear from the sky. Aura would have dragons composed of lava and magma and send them after the two. Urahara would have 3 dragons protect them and send 2 after Aura. Hisagi was perplexed when all this happened, as he could only stand around and watch. He then noticed Urahara's spiritual pressure disappear, and Aura would tell Yukio they have completed their mission and captured Urahara. Bewildered, Hisagi would stand there feeling useless, and the two would disappear. However, we would later find out that was the plan all along, to stage a battle so that Kisuke could infiltrate the enemy base in Book 3. All of this was done in typical Urahara fashion, putting on a show and not telling the poor Hisagi what actually happened, effectively manipulating him. Hisagi must have interviewed many people as a journalist, but this interview must have been the craziest one yet. While it was Hisagi who was the interviewer, it seemed like it was Urahara who was the real interviewer, dictating the pace of the conversation and prying out information from Hisagi, learning more about him and playing games to frustrate him. This whole interview might have just left a bigger scar on Hisagi than the one on his face. Hisagi was put through a whole range of emotions. He entered the puppet master's domain and was played like a fiddle throughout the supposed interview, really showing off the enigma that is Kisuke Urahara. This leads to Book 3. Urahara mysteriously disappeared after the events in Karakura town. He would show himself at the end of the big battle in Book 3, which I'll talk more about in later videos. Tokunada would make his escape to his secret lair, which was equipped with weapons equivalent to nukes. He decided to let them loose, but nothing worked. At first he suspected it was Aura, but then he remembered all the security measures and alarms he set in place. Then he would be met with a rather jolly voice through the communication devices he had, saying, "Oh, hello. Why, I suppose it's the first time meeting you, Mr. Tsunayashiro. Is that you, Kisuke Urahara?" Tokunada would surmise, to which Urahara would reply, "You know, I would always crush any surveillance bugs I found flying around my shop, so I feel like we've had a long relationship, Mr. Visual Department." As the voice of Urahara would reverberate through the castle, Hisagi would catch a glimpse of it, and then he'd find out that Urahara did not actually get captured. Yukio would explain how Aura had constant surveillance on her, and so Yukio and Urahara would communicate in unconventional ways, with Urahara using the tapping of his cane to do that. Yukio had encrypted the communications in complex company code, in the case that Tokunada would be able to read Morse code. But to keep things simple, Urahara was able to recognize immediately, which alarmed Yukio. He was pretty much able to decipher and communicate in a complex coding language which we've never seen before, and this is why Yukio and Aura often said Kisuke was terrifying. After a brief conversation with Tokunada and Urahara, Tokunada would decide to abandon ship and destroy his castle so it would come crashing down, eventually landing and destroying Karakura town if it did. Kisuke would then open up a giant garganta and with the help of Aura, transport the fallen castle to Wako Mundo. This was the end of the massive battle, but we would have some final words from Kisuke in the final chapter, as Hisagi would go to finish his interview. It was only after the interview was done that we got some information on Urahara. As Hisagi would leave, Yoruichi in her cat form would ask Kisuke if he was sure about letting Hisagi leave without altering his memory. Kisuke would mention Hisagi probably thinks the Hogyoku was made to make another Soul King, but he'd mention how that was wrong. He'd say, "All I wanted to do was to create something new, The goal for doing so was secondary. I just wanted to open a new door. I used the rail as an excuse to open the lock to that door. I simply followed my own desires. Fundamentally, I am no different from Mr. Kuretsuchi and how he sacrifices so many in order to fulfill his craving for research. Sacrifices so many was quite important here, perhaps alluding to how the Hogyaku was made. One theory was that he made his Hogyaku in a similar way to Aizen's. Perhaps from those in the maggot's nest, in jail from those who could no longer bear their sentence. That way it would have been more ethically favorable, but still morally grey, fitting of Kisuke. Or it could have been more so like how Aizen got it, or maybe even worse, who knows. Urahara would then say, "But Miss Hiyori did see through me. That's why, to take a neutral position, well, to be accurate, it's not neutral, but I decided to entrust some matters to a very Soul Reaper like Soul Reaper." His features softened then, as he spoke about Hisagi. "When the time comes that I really do become someone who could be called a villain, it would be best to leave behind someone who can definitely determine that I've sinned, right? I'm sure that Mr. Hisagi, who saw how Mr. Tosen was and saw how he left, well, he would do that. Of course, Mr. Kurosaki or Miss Kuchiki would work as well." It was interesting how he mentioned how Hiyori did see through him, perhaps being the only character who was able to. It also makes some of her comments on Kisuke even more interesting, which I have covered in the latter analysis part of this video. After a short conversation with Yoruichi, Kisuke would say the words, "Well, let's head off. Mr. Kurosaki and his friends might really be in hot water," to which Yoruichi would reply, "Really? You're such a busy man. Don't you think you're coddling Ichigo?" Urahara would say, "A small town candy shop is supposed to coddle the kids. Though I think Mr. Kurosaki is a bit too reliable to call a kid at this point." All of this really coming full circle, showing you the type of person Urahara has been throughout Ichigo's journey. Even now he is still looking out for him. In the writer's note at the end, it was also mentioned how the writer of Can't Fear Your Own World heard about the story of how Kisuke and Yoruichi met. He, among others, remarked how Kubo needs to show everyone that story through his manga, showing us there are still things we can learn and plenty of fun moments left from these characters.